Malik Harris lived by a strict routine that never failed. His days were quiet. Mornings started with coffee, work at his computer consumed most of the day, and evenings were spent reading or watching movies. He had no interest in loud parties, neighborhood gossip, or being part of the small, tight-knit community that surrounded him. Life in a prestigious neighborhood suited him because people mostly minded their own business. Still, he knew that some of his neighbors disapproved of his solitude. Their glances carried quiet judgment, but he ignored them. Everything changed on an otherwise ordinary day when he noticed his internet acting strangely. Malik frowned, refreshing a web page, but it loaded sluggishly. Video calls stuttered, music streams cut in and out. He paid for the highest speed plan. This shouldn't be happening. Assuming it was a temporary service issue, he opened his router settings to investigate. His eyes skimmed through the list of connected devices. His laptop, phone, TV, all familiar. But one name stood out, Westview_Cam01. He froze. That wasn't his. It wasn't a phone, a laptop, or a gaming console. It sounded like a surveillance camera. Someone was on his network, using his internet, but why? His jaw tightened as he quickly selected the option to forget all unknown devices and changed his Wi-Fi password. Problem solved. Everything should go back to normal. He dismissed the thought, but a faint sense of unease remained. Stepping outside for a stronger signal, he double-checked his network security while standing near his porch. As he scrolled through his phone, he felt a gaze on him. Across the street, behind a slightly parted curtain in the kitchen window, stood Beverly Mason. Malik had heard enough about her. Elderly, meticulous, always watching, always ready to call the police at the slightest sign of suspicious activity. She stared at him with that expression he recognized all too well. Wariness, distrust, the expectation of wrongdoing. She had never trusted him. He didn't know what about him bothered her most, his reclusive nature, his skin color, or his refusal to engage in idle neighborly small talk. But at this moment, standing outside with his phone in hand, he already knew what she was thinking. He was up to something. He exhaled, putting his phone away, not wanting to give her any more reason to stare. A final glance at his network settings confirmed that everything was under control. He turned, walked back inside, and locked the door. What he didn't know was that this simple moment, standing in his own yard, securing his own Wi-Fi, had already set things in motion. Across the street, Beverly was already reaching for her phone, dialing 911. Beverly Mason had always trusted her instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something wasn't right. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, had seen people come and go, and had learned to recognize when someone didn't fit in. Malik Harris was one of those people. He kept to himself, never attended block parties, barely spoke to anyone, and now here he was, standing outside, staring at his phone, tapping away like he was up to something. She watched him through the narrow gap in her curtains, her heart beating faster as he stood there unmoving, eyes locked on the screen, fingers working fast. She knew the signs: furtive behavior, calculated movements, a deliberate attempt to avoid attention. To her, it looked exactly like someone trying to hack into something or cover their tracks. He had never been friendly, never made an effort to be part of the community, and that alone made her uneasy. She grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. She knew she had no real proof, but something in her gut told her she had to act. Hesitation flickered for only a second before she made the call. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Beverly's words tumbled out fast. Yes, I need to report something suspicious. My neighbor, he's outside doing something with his phone. I don't know what, but it looks off. The dispatcher asked for clarification, but Beverly had none. He's just been standing there for a while, typing. He doesn't talk to anyone. He's never been friendly. I don't know, I have a bad feeling. The dispatcher hesitated but logged the report. A patrol car was dispatched. Beverly stayed by the window, watching as Malik eventually put his phone away and went inside. She told herself she had done the right thing. If he wasn't guilty of anything, then no harm done. But if he was, then she had just prevented something terrible. The police car arrived minutes later, its blue and red lights flashing as it slowed in front of Malik's house. Officers Clark and Robinson stepped out, assessing the scene. Clark, a tall, broad-shouldered man with years of experience, approached Beverly first. "Ma'am, you reported suspicious activity. Can you tell us exactly what you saw?" Beverly, still standing on her porch, folded her arms. He was outside on his phone, standing in the same spot for a long time, typing really fast. He never does that. He never interacts with anyone. I don't trust him. Clark exchanged a look with Robinson, a younger officer with a skeptical expression. "Ma'am, did you actually see him do anything illegal?" Robinson asked, arms resting at his sides, voice measured. Beverly hesitated. "No, but," Clark cut in. "We'll check it out." They walked up to Malik's door and knocked firmly. Inside, Malik, who had just sat down at his computer, frowned at the sound. He wasn't expecting anyone. He stood, opened the door, and found himself face to face with two uniformed officers. "Mr. Harris?" Clark asked, posture firm but not aggressive. "Yeah," Malik said cautiously. "What's going on?" Clark adjusted his belt. "We received a report about suspicious activity in your yard. Would you mind telling us what you were doing outside just now?" Malik's eyebrows lifted in disbelief. "I was changing my Wi-Fi password," he said, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "Someone was using my internet. I kicked them off and reset everything." Clark studied him. "Do you mind showing us?" Malik sighed, but he knew how these situations could escalate if he refused. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside and grabbing his laptop. He opened the router settings and turned the screen toward them. "See for yourself." Clark leaned in, scanning the list of devices, when something caught his eye. "Westview_Cam01, he read aloud. "That's the one I didn't recognize," Malik said. "I don't own anything by that name." Clark exchanged another glance with Robinson, his expression shifting from neutral to slightly concerned. "Can you tell where that device is connecting from?" he asked. Malik hesitated, then started typing. What he found made his stomach tighten. "It's still connected," he muttered, eyes narrowing. Clark straightened. "Then let's find out who it belongs to." Malik's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, his eyes scanning through lines of connection logs, searching for answers. His heart pounded as he traced the signal from the unknown device, digging deeper into its activity. The moment he saw the data stream, his breath caught. This wasn't just someone stealing Wi-Fi. The device wasn't being used for casual browsing or free internet access. It was accessing cameras. His cameras. The realization sent a chill down his spine, but the deeper he looked, the worse it got. The connection logs didn't just show his IP address. It showed multiple others, each corresponding to a different home in the neighborhood. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't someone piggybacking off his internet to watch Netflix. Someone was watching them. He turned to the officers, his voice tight. "This isn't just my Wi-Fi being used. This device is pulling security footage, from my cameras and from others." Clark leaned in, his expression shifting from skeptical to serious. "Wait, what?" Malik tapped the screen, pulling up the logs, showing the timestamps, the remote access points, the continuous data stream. "It's been running for weeks. Whoever set this up has been monitoring multiple homes in the area. This isn't a one-time thing. This is systematic." Beverly, who had been standing stiffly behind the officers, let out a harsh scoff. "That's ridiculous. He's just trying to confuse you," she snapped, arms crossed. "I don't believe any of this. He's probably the one behind it." Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. He clicked another tab, pulling up the live feed access. "Then explain this," he said flatly. The screen refreshed, and suddenly, there it was, a grainy but unmistakable video feed. A view of a living room, a couch, a dining table, a kitchen counter. Beverly's kitchen counter. The room fell into stunned silence. Beverly's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She blinked, then leaned in, her face paling. "That's my house." The realization landed hard. "That's impossible," she muttered, shaking her head. "That camera's inside my house." Malik nodded, his voice calm but firm. And I don't have access to your cameras, Beverly. But someone else does. The weight of those words settled over the room like a suffocating fog. Officer Robinson shifted, suddenly alert. Are you telling us someone's been spying on people in this neighborhood? Malik exhaled, his pulse still hammering. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Clark's expression hardened. This had gone from a misunderstanding to something much bigger. He pulled his radio from his belt. We need a tech specialist down here. Now. Robinson was already pacing, rubbing his chin. Jesus, he muttered. How many houses? Malik scrolled through the logs, his stomach turning with each new feed. At least 5. Maybe more. The connections jump around, probably to avoid detection. Beverly sank onto a chair, her hands shaking. Who would do this? Her voice was small now, the defiance gone, replaced by something Malik recognized, fear. Malik had no answer, but Clark did. We're going to find out. 15 minutes later, the specialist arrived, a wiry man with glasses and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He wasted no time, connecting his equipment, scanning the network, and confirming the worst. It's a decentralized access hub, he said grimly. Someone built a ghost network. They're feeding video through a series of relays, which means whoever's behind this knows what they're doing. He glanced at the officers, his voice steady but urgent. This isn't just an invasion of privacy. This is illegal surveillance. And it's happening right under your noses. Malik's fingers moved fast, cross-referencing IP logs, tracking signal strength, tracing where the data was being sent. The hacker had been careful, bouncing the feeds through different relays, but not careful enough. There was always a source, and Malik was going to find it. His breath was steady, but his mind was racing. He filtered out secondary connections, eliminated distant pings, and focused on the strongest, most consistent signal. It didn't take long. The address appeared on his screen. His stomach dropped. The transmission was coming from a house just across the street. He stared at the result for a moment, almost not believing it, but the numbers didn't lie. The house belonged to the Hunters. More specifically, the connection was traced to Thomas Hunter, their 19-year-old son, a quiet college student who lived at home with his parents. Beverly let out a sharp gasp the moment she saw the address. Her head shook in disbelief, her eyes darting between the officers and Malik. No, she blurted out. That can't be right. The Hunters? That's ridiculous. I've known them for years. They're good people. Clark didn't react, his face unreadable, but Robinson exhaled heavily. Doesn't matter what kind of people they are, he said. The signal's coming from that house. Beverly folded her arms, her voice shaking. Maybe there's a mistake. Maybe someone's using their internet the same way Malik's was being used. Malik glanced at her, unimpressed. She had been so quick to assume the worst about him, but now that the evidence pointed to someone she trusted, she was grasping for explanations. There's only one way to find out, Clark said, already turning toward the door. We talked to them. The walk across the street felt heavier than it should have. Malik didn't follow. He had no intention of standing on their doorstep while this played out. Instead, he watched from his own porch as Clark and Robinson knocked. Moments later, the door opened, revealing Mr. and Mrs. Hunter, both in their late 40s, dressed in casual clothes, confusion written all over their faces. Officers? Mr. Hunter asked, his brow furrowed. Is something wrong? Clark didn't waste time. We need to speak with your son, Thomas. Mrs. Hunter blinked, looking between them. Thomas? What's this about? Robinson glanced at Clark, then sighed. We have reason to believe someone from this address is involved in unauthorized surveillance of multiple homes in this neighborhood. Silence. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Mr. Hunter's face hardened. I think you have the wrong house, he said firmly. My son wouldn't do something like that. Mrs. Hunter shook her head, pressing a hand to her chest. That's absurd. Thomas is a good kid. He studies, he works part-time, he barely leaves his room. He's not a criminal. Clark remained neutral. We're not making accusations yet. We just need to speak to him. Another pause. Mr. Hunter exchanged a look with his wife before reluctantly stepping aside. "Fine," he muttered. "But I promise you, this is a waste of time." They disappeared inside. The officers waited. Beverly hovered near the sidewalk, arms still crossed, her face unreadable. Then, finally, footsteps. The door creaked open again, and there he was, Thomas Hunter. Tall, lanky, with messy dark hair and tired eyes. He looked like any other college student. But there was something off in the way he held himself. His posture was stiff. His fingers twitched at his sides. His gaze flickered too quickly from the officers to his parents to Beverly, then back again. Clark studied him. "Thomas, do you know why we're here?" Thomas licked his lips. "No idea," he said, but his voice wasn't steady. Robinson crossed his arms. "We traced a network breach to this address. Someone in this house has been accessing private security feeds. You want to explain that?" Thomas let out a short laugh. Too short, too forced. "That's insane. I don't even know how to do that." Clark wasn't buying it. "Then maybe you can explain why the signal is coming directly from here." Thomas's jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward his parents, then back to the officers. He hesitated. A fraction too long. Then he exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I swear, this isn't me. Someone must be setting me up." Malik didn't trust the system. He had seen too many stories of investigations dragging on, evidence getting lost, and suspects slipping through cracks. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for the police to figure this out at their slow, methodical pace. This was his neighborhood, his privacy that had been invaded, and now that he had uncovered the first layer of the truth, he wasn't about to stop digging. Sitting at his desk, he reopened the network logs, running a deep trace on the device's activity. His fingers moved with precision, bypassing standard diagnostic tools and diving into raw data. The screen flashed with numbers and code as he scanned for anomalies, cross-referencing timestamps, searching for anything out of place. Then he saw it. The connection had changed. The Westview_Cam01 device was gone, but another had taken its place. The moment the police started questioning Thomas, the surveillance shifted. A new network ID appeared, operating under a different signal. Someone else was still watching. Malik's pulse quickened. This wasn't just one person running a voyeuristic stunt. This was bigger. He leaned back, staring at the screen, piecing it together. If the cameras switched networks, that meant there was more than one access point. It meant the surveillance wasn't limited to Thomas's house. It meant someone else, someone smarter, had been running the real operation. And now they knew they were being hunted. Meanwhile, across the street, officers Clark and Robinson were growing less convinced that Thomas was their only suspect. His reaction was off, but it wasn't the reaction of someone who had orchestrated something this elaborate. He was scared, but not the right kind of scared. Not the fear of getting caught, more like the fear of being set up. When they pressed him about the connection, his panic seemed real. "I don't know anything about cameras," he insisted, his voice strained. "Yeah, I'm into tech, but I've never hacked into anything. I swear. If there's a signal coming from here, someone else put it there." Clark exchanged a look with Robinson. It wasn't impossible. If someone had hijacked Thomas's IP, they could have framed him. But if that was the case, then who? And how many others were involved? Back in his house, Malik was still tracking the new network ID, but every time he got close to identifying its origin, it vanished. Someone was scrubbing the data in real time, covering their tracks the moment he followed the trail. Whoever this was, they weren't just some amateur playing around with hacking tools. They were careful, methodical, and fast. Too fast. Malik's jaw clenched as he realized what it meant. They knew someone was onto them. They were erasing their presence. His mind raced for solutions. He needed them to make a mistake. He needed to bait them into revealing themselves. That's when the idea hit him. He exhaled slowly, calming his heartbeat, then moved back to his router settings. With a few keystrokes, he reset everything, making it look like he had given up. Then he deliberately left his Wi-Fi unprotected. No password. No encryption. An open invitation. If they were watching, they'd see it. And if they were desperate to regain control, they'd take the bait. He sat back and waited. If they thought he had surrendered, if they thought he was just another helpless civilian, then they had underestimated him. Malik wasn't just watching anymore. He was hunting. Malik sat in the dim glow of his monitor, eyes locked on the screen, watching, waiting. The trap was set. His network was wide open, an irresistible target for anyone desperate to regain access. Hours passed. He didn't move. He barely blinked. Then it happened. A new device appeared, connecting to his network like a moth to a flame. The logs updated in real time, showing an unfamiliar IP address tethered to his system. Malik's pulse quickened as he pulled the data, tracing its origin. His fingers worked fast, peeling back layers of encryption, forcing the connection to reveal its true source. His breath caught in his throat. The signal wasn't coming from a house. It wasn't even coming from a private network. It was coming from the police station. His first instinct was disbelief. It had to be a mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. The connection was live, streaming from inside law enforcement headquarters. He felt a cold wave rush through him. This wasn't just some random hacker. This was someone with access. Someone inside the system. Someone with the authority to manipulate evidence, erase files, control what was seen and what wasn't. Someone who had been watching for far longer than anyone realized. He stared at the screen, the implications settling in. If this was coming from the police department, that meant the real perpetrator wasn't Thomas. It wasn't some outsider. It was one of them. An officer. A detective. Someone with enough power to run surveillance on an entire neighborhood without anyone suspecting a thing. Malik's stomach twisted. He had been ready for a fight, but not this. Not corruption sitting in the very system that was supposed to protect them. Clark and Robinson were still at Thomas's house, pressing him for answers he didn't have, when Malik's phone rang. He answered without hesitation. "You need to get back here now." His voice was sharp, controlled, but laced with urgency. "I found the source." Clark didn't argue. Minutes later, the officers were inside Malik's house, standing over his shoulder, eyes scanning the screen. The moment Clark saw the IP address, his expression darkened. "You're telling me this is coming from the station?" Robinson exhaled sharply. "That's impossible." Malik shook his head. "No, it's not. Someone inside your department is running this operation. Someone with access, someone smart enough to cover their tracks, until now." Clark ran a hand over his face, trying to process the weight of what he was seeing. If Malik was right, this wasn't just about illegal surveillance. This was about trust. About betrayal. About someone abusing their badge in a way that could destroy lives. Robinson muttered a curse under his breath. "If this is real, we can't trust anyone." Malik nodded slowly. "Exactly." That was the moment he knew. He couldn't rely on them. Not completely. Even if Clark and Robinson were clean, there was no telling how deep this ran. One wrong move, one word to the wrong person, and all the evidence could disappear. Whoever was behind this had already erased trails before. If they suspected the investigation was closing in, they'd do it again. Malik wasn't going to let that happen. He had one chance. One person he knew could blow this wide open without interference. He grabbed his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and pressed call. The line rang twice before a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered. Janice Ray. Investigative journalist. Known for exposing corruption. Feared by politicians and law enforcement alike. Malik took a breath and spoke, his voice steady, his decision made. "I have a story for you. And it's big." The article dropped at dawn. Police surveillance scandal. Unauthorized neighborhood spying linked to insider operation. The headline hit like a gunshot, sending shockwaves through the city before most people had even poured their first cup of coffee. It was all there, evidence of a rogue surveillance network, unauthorized access to private security feeds, and the chilling revelation that the operation was being run from inside the police department. Names weren't mentioned. Sources remained anonymous. But the message was clear. Someone in law enforcement had turned the city into their personal observation deck, watching families in their most intimate moments, violating the very laws they were sworn to uphold. And now they had been exposed. Within hours, the department was in chaos. Officers whispered in break rooms, detectives exchanged tense glances, commanders barked orders demanding to know how the hell this had leaked. Meetings were called, explanations were demanded, paranoia seeped into the walls like a virus. Someone in uniform had just been publicly accused of running an illegal operation, and no one knew who could be trusted. Files were reviewed. Systems were checked. But the worst part? The public now knew. The city was watching. The media swarmed, asking for statements, shoving microphones in the faces of officials who suddenly had no answers. Panic spread through the ranks. Because if the truth got out, if the real culprit was named, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be war. Malik sat in his house, watching it all unfold, feeling a twisted mix of satisfaction and dread. He had given Janice everything she needed, making sure his name was nowhere in the story. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what happened to people who exposed the wrong secrets. But that didn't mean he was safe. The first call came just after noon. His phone buzzed with an unknown number, the sound slicing through the silence. He hesitated before answering. A low voice, smooth and deliberate, oozed through the speaker. "You should have minded your own business." Malik's grip tightened on the phone. No yelling, no threats of violence. Just a quiet statement, laced with a promise. "You crossed a line," the voice continued, "and you won't get another warning." The call ended before he could respond. His stomach knotted. He had expected retaliation, but hearing it, knowing someone was close enough to call him directly, made his skin crawl. He glanced around his house, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every creak in the floorboards. They knew. They knew it was him. And they weren't going to let it slide. By nightfall, the unease had settled into something sharper, a gut feeling he couldn't shake. He double-checked his locks, set up motion detectors on his phone, kept the curtains drawn. But none of it mattered. Because at 2:37 a.m., he woke to the sound of glass shattering. The air reeked of gasoline before he even registered the flames. His living room window was engulfed in orange glow, fire licking up the walls, spreading fast. Adrenaline took over. He didn't think, he moved. Snatching his phone, he bolted for the back door, shoving it open just as smoke thickened around him. His lungs burned. Heat seared his skin. The fire was too fast, too intentional. This wasn't an accident. It was a message. A final warning, meant to silence him permanently. He stumbled onto the lawn, coughing, watching as his house, his life, went up in flames. Sirens screamed in the distance, neighbors spilling onto their porches, eyes wide with horror. But Malik wasn't watching them. He was scanning the street, the shadows, the faces in the crowd. Someone was watching. Someone who wanted him gone. And now he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a target. Malik vanished before sunrise. His house was gone, his identity exposed, his every move watched. Staying in the city was suicide. He packed what little he had left, wiped his devices, ditched his phone, and disappeared. But disappearing didn't mean stopping. He wasn't running. He was regrouping. The fire had taken everything, but it hadn't erased the truth. His laptop had been destroyed, but his files weren't. He had backups, encrypted and stored in places no one could reach. He had every log, every trace, every thread of evidence that tied the surveillance network back to someone inside law enforcement. The problem was, now they knew it too. Meanwhile, inside the department, Clark and Robinson were watching their own backs. The article had made things dangerous, but it was the fire that changed everything. Someone was desperate to bury this. Someone high up. Clark had been a cop long enough to know when something smelled wrong, and this stank of an inside job. He and Robinson worked quietly, combing through internal logs, reviewing personnel access records, looking for any sign of who had the power to set up an operation like this. It didn't take long before a pattern emerged. The same name kept appearing in restricted files, in system overrides, in reports that had been mysteriously locked or redacted. Lieutenant Daniel Jefferson. The name sent a ripple through the department. Jefferson wasn't just anyone. He was the guy, a decorated officer, a respected leader, a man who played mentor to rookies and handled PR like a politician. If the public trusted anyone in law enforcement, it was him. And that was exactly why he had been able to get away with this for so long. He had built the surveillance network piece by piece, disguising it as a security initiative, convincing the right people that it was for community protection. The people above him looked the other way. The people below him followed orders. And anyone who asked questions didn't ask them twice. But now, the questions weren't going away. The article had forced the department into the spotlight. The media had latched onto the story, digging deeper, demanding answers. The police chief called for an internal audit, a performance review, a compliance check, all the usual bureaucratic stall tactics. It was obvious what was happening. They weren't looking for the truth. They were trying to bury it. Malik saw it unfolding from the shadows. He moved between safe houses, avoiding digital trails, communicating through encrypted channels. Every day the risk grew. Every day, the threats got louder. But so did the pressure on the department. More reporters started sniffing around. More sources came forward. The city wasn't buying the silence. And Malik knew one thing. If he wanted to end this, he had to stop hiding. He made the decision on a cold morning, sitting in a motel room with a burner phone and a single text drafted on the screen. Ready to talk? Let's meet. He sent it to Janice Ray. No turning back now. The meeting took place in an underground parking garage, the kind of place where deals happened in shadows and secrets didn't echo. Janice stepped out of her car, her face unreadable, her posture sharp. Malik was already there, hood up, body tense. He handed her a flash drive. Everything. Unfiltered. Names, timestamps, money trails. Jefferson isn't working alone. Janice took it, her eyes locked on his. You understand what this means? Malik exhaled. Yeah. It means they're going to try to kill me. Janice nodded. Then let's make sure it's too late for that. By the time the next article hit, his face was everywhere. There was no more hiding. The world was watching. And now, so was Jefferson. The press conference was a spectacle. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and the weight of anticipation settled over the packed room like a brewing storm. At the center of it all stood Janice Ray, calm, sharp, and unwavering. She had done this before, taken down corrupt officials, exposed hidden scandals. But this was different. This was bigger. She adjusted the microphone, let the room still, then dropped the bombshell. Over the past several months, a secret surveillance network has been operating within this city, led by a high-ranking officer within law enforcement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She didn't pause. She clicked her laptop, and on the massive screen behind her, evidence unfolded, logs, footage, access records, financial transactions, a digital footprint that led straight to Lieutenant Daniel Jefferson. His face appeared on the screen, frozen in time, a man who had spent years building trust now exposed as the architect of mass surveillance, coercion, and corruption. The questions came fast, but Jenna stayed in control. How long has this been going on? How many people were affected? Who else is involved? But the real question, the one that burned behind every word, was simple. How deep does this go? Meanwhile, across the city, Jefferson was already in handcuffs. The arrest happened quietly, tucked away from the chaos of the press conference, a calculated move to control the fallout. Officers led him out of the department in the dead of night, avoiding cameras, avoiding spectacle, avoiding accountability. But something was off. Malik knew it before he even saw the reports. It was too smooth, too contained. And he was right. Within 24 hours, things began to disappear. Key files vanished. Chain of command signatures were suddenly missing. Video footage that had clearly linked Jefferson to the operation became corrupted. The case against him, once ironclad, was falling apart in real time. The message was clear. Someone was pulling strings, erasing evidence, making sure Jefferson wouldn't take the full fall. Maybe he'd do some time, but he wouldn't lose everything. He'd take a reduced charge, he'd cut a deal, and someone else, someone higher up, would keep their hands clean. Malik felt sick. He had risked everything, nearly died for this, and yet the system was already trying to protect itself. The fallout didn't stop there. Clark and Robinson paid the price for digging too deep. Robinson was transferred to traffic duty, A clear demotion. Clark wasn't so lucky. Fired. No explanation, just restructuring. They weren't heroes. They weren't celebrated. They were tossed aside like loose ends. Malik watched it happen from a distance, powerless, furious, unsurprised. And then there was Beverly. She came to him 3 days later, standing on the sidewalk outside the charred remains of his house, clutching a paper bag, her hands trembling. Malik didn't speak. He just waited. "I was wrong," she finally said, voice small, fragile. "About you. About everything." She handed him the bag, homemade cornbread, a small, useless gesture, but the weight of it said more than words. "I judged you," she admitted, "before I even knew the truth. And I called the cops when I should have been listening." Malik took the bag, not because he forgave her, but because he saw the guilt in her eyes. "Do better," he said, voice steady. She nodded, tears welling. And then she was gone. But even as the dust settled, Malik knew this wasn't justice. This was survival. The system didn't break overnight. It wouldn't change because of one article, one arrest, one apology. It was bigger than him, bigger than Jefferson, bigger than all of them. But he also knew something else. They tried to silence him. And they failed. Malik left before the sun rose. A bus, a plane, a rental car. He didn't care where he ended up as long as it was far from the city that had burned his life to the ground. He didn't run out of fear. He ran because he had done his part, and now the fight belonged to someone else. He had no home to return to, no job to reclaim, no safety net waiting to catch him. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that his name had become something bigger than a man. He was the face of exposure, the proof that the system could bleed if you cut deep enough. Even in exile, his story echoed. News anchors debated his impact. College students wore shirts with his name printed across them in bold, defiant letters. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Malik was right. Hashtag Wizzy. Hashtag no more watching. The machine hadn't been dismantled, but it had been wounded, and for the first time, people weren't looking away. Beverly changed too. The woman who had once feared Malik, who had once called the police on him without hesitation, now stood in front of City Hall with a megaphone, demanding transparency. She had been forced to see the ugly truth, not just about the surveillance scandal, but about herself, about the way she had judged a black man for existing while excusing monsters in uniform. She couldn't undo the past, but she could fight for a better future, and so she did. She became a voice for accountability, loud, relentless, unshakable. She went to council meetings, she confronted officials, she forced them to listen. Meanwhile, the officers who had built the surveillance network had begun to disappear. Some resigned quietly, slipping into the shadows before the noose tightened. Some took sudden, urgent transfers to distant cities, hoping to escape the fallout. Some lawyered up, knowing that lawsuits were coming. But none of them could erase what had been exposed. Jefferson, the man who had orchestrated the entire operation, still walked free, but his legacy was in ruins. His name was poison, his reputation shattered, his influence erased. He had avoided a prison cell, but he would never escape the truth. His face was now synonymous with corruption, and no amount of backroom deals could scrub that away. Malik, now hidden in a new city, began to write. He spent months in libraries, coffee shops, hotel rooms, putting everything onto the page. The fear, the fire, the betrayals, the paranoia, the truth that had nearly killed him. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about why it happened. How power was built on secrecy. How justice was a myth when the people meant to uphold it were the ones breaking the law. How the system didn't need a single villain. It was designed to protect itself at all costs. He didn't write for revenge. He wrote because the truth deserved to live longer than he did. By the time the book hit shelves, he knew what to expect. Some people called him a hero. Some called him a liar. Some called him a dangerous man who had made things worse. The police department dismissed him as a disgruntled conspiracy theorist. Politicians dodged questions about his allegations. But none of it mattered. Because people were listening. Because his words had taken root, and roots had a way of breaking through concrete. He didn't get the perfect ending. The system didn't collapse overnight. No grand revolution erased corruption in a single sweep. Jefferson wasn't rotting in a prison cell. The world kept turning, just as messy, just as broken. But he had done the one thing they never wanted him to do. He had told the truth. And once the truth was out, it was unstoppable.